welcome back to the South Main Auto Channel. Got this 2010 Hyundai Elantra here. Coming today for just some routine work, and one of those items includes a front brake job. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to kind of show just some very general procedures that we use doing a brake job, and really kind of focus on the importance of cleaning up the brake caliper hardware, you know, the actual brake caliper mounting bracket where the pads go, installing new hardware, and kind of just focusing on why that's important. And it may sound kind of silly to some of you, but it is all too often we see brakes that come in that are either done by, you know, other shops, they were done by, you know, DIYers, and it seems to be the thing everybody skips, or the stuff that people don't seem to see as important. And so we're going to kind of look at that. I'm going to show you the method I use to install new brake hardware, and you know, why I think it's important. So before we begin, pull the cap off our brake fluid reservoir here. We're just going to leave it sitting up on there loose because we're going to push the pistons back in, and you're going to want to make sure that inside your brake reservoir that there's actually going to be enough room for this fluid to expand in there. We can see our brake fluid, we can't on the camera, but the fluid level is way down below the maximum. There should be plenty of room for expansion in there. If there's not, or you suspect there's not, you're just going to have to extract a little bit of brake fluid. Use like an old turkey baster. Basically, that's pretty much all of our brake fluid extractor looks like. You know, suck some of that old fluid out of there and give yourself enough room. So these brakes look like they're pretty well, just visual inspection, look like they're worn pretty well, evenly worn out, obviously, because it's coming in for a brake job. Got a lot of rust on these rotors because it's New York. We use a lot of salt, but a lot of times we like to take a look at, you know, brake job failures, or, you know, yeah, I guess brake job failures we can call them, or brake failures, or, you know, worn out pads, because we want to see, you know, why they wore out. It's just age and time on this vehicle, but often you'll see, you know, the brake pads will tell us a story. You know, if the inside pad's brand new, the outside one's smoked, or, you know, vice versa, or they're wore cockeyed. You know, all kinds of different scenarios can tell us, you know, why things happened like they did. You know, whether the caliper pins are seized up, you know, whether the pads are seized in the holders, which is probably, oh gosh, it's a high percentage. Over 80% of the brakes we see are pads seized in their holders, and most vehicles I see are higher mileage, so they're on their second brake job. And all too often we see this because people neglect the brake hardware. As silly as it sounds, you know, these little tin clips, you know, for whatever reason, you know, people will reuse them. They won't clean the brackets, they'll grind off the pads, and it just turns into a disaster. So I'm just going to show you in this video, as I've shown probably in other videos, how we install brake hardware on the caliper brackets to kind of prevent this from happening and make the pads last their whole life cycle. Now, first thing first, I'm going to bust these Phillips head screws loose in this rotor where everything's still stationary. Use my impact driver. Typically they're frozen there pretty well, so we try to get them on the first whack. Everything I'm going to do here on the passenger side, I'm going to go right over and do on the driver's side, so I'll be showing one side in this video. Take and peel our brake caliper off here. Now I know we're working on a 2010 Elantra here, but this is going to apply to just about every front wheel, or I should say every disc brake out there. It's not really so much specific to this car, so just kind of keep that in mind throughout this process. You know, just apply this to everything that you work on that has disc brakes. Most everything, there's always variables, but they're all quite similar, as you'll see. Now that we got the caliper out of the way, we can see how our pads are worn. You know, obviously worn right down, a little bit crooked, But gosh, I'll tell you, they're worn pretty even given our area that we live in. And they're not too awful seized in the holders. Yeah, I've seen a whole lot worse. I mean, I've seen these things where you just gotta beat them out of there with a hammer. That one was seized up a bit there. And you can see what happens as the pad were to seize on the brake hardware here, how it would hold one side of the pad. Let's say, for example, this is the wrong way, but if it was seized up on the bottom and only the top moved, how it would just make that a pivot point, or cause the pad to just hang up and just fry right off there. But these pads wore pretty even, honestly. And while we're right here, we're going to we'll zip off our caliper bracket, hopefully. You gotta watch these, this style caliper bracket uses this fine millimeter 14 thread bolt. Boy, they really like to season these spindles, and man, it'll pop the head right off them real quick. This is new enough, I don't think we're gonna have that problem, but grab a swivel. Break that one loose by hand. Like I said, we're gonna have to be careful, because if it's seized in that bracket, boy, it'll be a real pain. Stick our other bolt in there, that way when we push up on this, it doesn't come up and sneak up on us. No, not too bad. Swivel on the impact will suck a lot of power out of an impact, so especially if you're starting kind of at a tight angle or the wrong angle. There, not too bad. There. Taking this hanger caliper prop out of the way for right now. Hoses are, relatively rigid on these calipers. Just good habit to not let them hang from the hoses. If the hoses are old, they should be replaced anyways, but just avoid any kind of damage. Hang your caliper. These caliper hanging hooks are pretty cheap. You can use, old clothes hanger, zip tie, whatever. Pretty clean. So our rotor is going in the trash, so we just whale it off with the air hammer. Use a big hammer or whatever you have there to take that off. Not really important for this job to not mar it up or be careful with it. So what we can do now is just kind of start on some of our preparations for the new rotors, new pads, new hardware. And I like to kind of have everything cleaned up before I put the caliper bracket back on. So we'll just start with the caliper, and of course you'll find, lots of controversy on this. Usually I'll push in one with the other one still on. Depending on what kind of brake system it is, you certainly could push fluid right back in the other caliper and pop the piston out, depending on how they're tied together. These independent four-wheel ABS systems, typically that won't happen. You'll see that most people, or a lot of people, some people, I guess I don't really know the statistics there, they're always going to squeal, pull the bleeder before you push it in. A lot of times in, here in upstate New York, that's not even an option. You just don't, get bleeders out very easily. However, these ones would come out. I've done tens of thousands of brake jobs, and, shameful or not, I've never opened a bleeder to push a piston back in. If the fluid is, super nasty, or you check it with a test strip and it's full of moisture and its boil point is reduced, I'll still just push the piston in, offer the customer a service to do a brake fluid flush. and usually get denied, 9 out of 10 times. But it is important. So if you're doing your own, you want to open the bleeder, push the piston back, fill the reservoir with all new fluid, flush out the old fluid. That's great. But like I say, here in the shop, we always have to sell other services, so we can't always do that. But if you're going to push your piston back in, I wouldn't be afraid of doing it without opening the bleeder, simply because I've never seen anything bad, any bad results because of it, I guess. We got a caliper right here in an effort to stop brake noise. I find that the majority of brake noise, squeals, customer complaints will typically come anywhere that there's a metal-to-metal contact, whether it's the piston on the pad, caliper on the pad, quite often the hardware, where the hardware goes in the caliper bracket, or the lack of, if a customer has done their own brakes and pads didn't fit, so they left the hardware out, you can get a lot of brake noise there. So it's always our habit to any metal-to-metal contact surface, we always clean it up. Even hub to rotor, we make sure all those surfaces are clean, free of rust, and then we're going to lubricate any metal-to-metal contact, on the exception of the outside of the hardware to the pad. It's the only area that I don't lubricate, just because experience has taught me that that usually brings in more debris and dirt and dust and salt, and kind of is more of a hindrance than anything. You can use a lot of different techniques doing this, whether you use a flat file. I'm going to use a little abrasive disc. It's going to kind of come in here on its edge. This isn't that bad on this one, so it's not a great example, but if the rust is built up quite heavily, you have to come in here and chip it off. If it's severely pitted, a lot of times you just have to replace the caliper. Be mindful of the face of the piston too. Some calipers use a steel piston, some use a phenolic piston, or plastic. You want to make sure that face of that surface is clean, but be mindful of the seal that's around it. You don't want to break that. If that's ruptured, then you're going to need a new caliper, or you're going to have to rebuild the one you have. You don't want to let dirt and crap in there on that piston and seize that up. Well, it looks like we did a good job on that. One thing to think about when you're cleaning up rust, whether it's on the hub, it's on the caliper bracket, it's on the caliper itself, is I see people sometimes come in with a wire wheel. If it's not a really stiff wire wheel or wire brush, more often than not, all it does is polishes up the rust. So you gotta be careful of that, because we want to remove the rust, we don't want to just shine it up. And if you're using a power tool, like a die grinder, be careful not to remove metal. We don't want to remove the material, we just want to remove the rust. So, like I say, a flat file works great at removing rust, especially if it's a flat cut end, because you can actually kind of come in and scrape the rust off. Then your file will stay straight as you work across it and remove the rust. And a lot of times at home, this is the best tool to use, in my opinion, to remove rust. So just kind of keep that in mind. No job's complete without brake cleaner, right? Not too often we use it on brakes, but anyhow, I'm going to take and get all the rest of the dust and debris and crap we stirred up from cleaning everything off here. A little bit of brake cleaner. That way we can put it together as clean as possible. We'll clean off our hub here, particularly if there's any old grease on there. Which we often use, just putting wheels on in the shop, particularly around here, to keep them from seizing up. We'll get all that old stuff off and reapply new. Now we've got this all prepared for to receive the new pads, new rotors. We don't have to worry about when we have our rotor on here getting dirt and junk all over it, because everything here is good to go. We're going to go work on the caliper bracket. Like I say, in my mind, the more important part, and the often most overlooked, most neglected part. And this is a great example as to why not to reuse brake hardware. I'm going to show you on this one, what happens. And you got to keep in mind that this hardware has been on there the entire life of the pads also. So it essentially wears out with the pads. And I guess a lot of people wouldn't, you just don't think of that or you don't consider that, but I just want you to have a look at this. I don't know if the camera's going to do a good job representing this, but we can see on the hardware here some real heavy scoring and wear marks, and that's going to be where the ear of the pad, this portion right here, this little C shape, where that was starting to rust or starting to rust behind the hardware, and really putting a squeeze on that thing, and you can see where it's actually wore down the hardware itself. A lot of scoring, and it's almost wore paper thin right here on the edge on both of these ears. So that's just a really good example as to how the hardware wears along with your brake pads. The area we're going to be focusing on a lot is right here. And this is where a lot of trouble happens. You get rust, builds up on the bracket, squeezes out on the hardware, and ultimately, pinches our pad where our pad's supposed to slide freely, and that's when everything comes to a halt. Give me another look at that hardware. Hopefully you can see that. It's kind of hard to represent on film, but boy, by the eye you can tell, boy, that thing's really grooved up and scored in there pretty deep. Again, there's a lot of methods you can use to clean caliper brackets. What we do, because we do brake jobs daily, we just throw these in the sandblast cabinet. I'm just going to sandblast off these areas here where the hardware rides. Again, you can use a flat file, which works fabulous here, especially like a double cut file or a small square file. Again, you don't want to remove material, you just want to get all the rust off. It's also a good time to have a look at our caliper pins. Make sure they've got an ample amount of grease on them. Make sure they're not seized up. We'll pull both of these out. We'll clean off of the old lube. We'll stick a little bit of new lube on there. You want to be careful not to over lube them or get a lot of lube on the front side of the pin. I've seen this a couple instances come in where guys doing a brake job, brand new brakes, pads, you did everything correctly, got too much lube on this, and particularly if they have this rubber sealing ring on the front of them to dampen noise, you get a lot of grease in the front of that. When you push it in, the pin's going to want to push itself right back out. Even if you finally get it in, what has happened, and I wouldn't believe this unless I seen it firsthand, having too much grease in front of it, as the brakes heat up, it just drives this pin right out, and it pushes that caliper out so hard it'll darn near lock the brakes up right solid. I've seen it twice now, I guess in 15 years. So it's kind of an anomaly, but it can happen. So I would just say, wipe the old grease off, just put a small amount on the outsides of it, and just be careful not to get a ton of it on the front of it to kind of stop that hydraulic action from pushing that out. Just tearing this passenger side apart before I went and blasted them off in the sandblast cabinet. And this one here shows evidence of wear on this hardware more so than the driver's side did. And you can see that, right there. That's represented right there quite well, I think. You can see the heavy amounts of wear that these abutment clips took. Got our caliper brackets all cleaned up. Got to take and toss our rotor up on there. I always grease between the rotor and the hub, or the hub face, just to keep it. I lost my knife. Just to keep it from seizing on there. Most important thing is to have the surface clean. Make sure there's no debris on it. You got to think about it. If there's a speck of rust on here that's going to hold this out a thousandth of an inch all the way at the hub face, by the time that gets all the way out here to the end of the rotor, that number gets multiplied and can actually just make your brake shimmy, or give it the sensation of having a warped rotor when indeed you don't. So that is the most important part. Have that hub surface clean, and be think about when you put your rotor on. Is there anything surrounding that when you put it on? A bunch of junk's going to fall behind it. So you want to kind of think about that. When we put them up on there, this particular style has these screws that hold the rotor on in place. A lot of them don't. If they don't, you can just simply take one of your wheel nuts, put that back on to hold the rotor steady for you while you finish your brake job, and to prevent stuff from getting dropped in between the rotor and the hub face. Those screws, they don't have to be, wicked tight. because they don't do anything. They serve no purpose, I guess, once the wheel assembly's on, wheel holds the rotor on. So we simply hang the rotors. I hose them down, wipe them off with a clean rag. We'll do that both on the inside and outside surface. You can see there's you know, some oil. You know, some people refer to it as cosmoline. I don't know what the exact makeup of the oil is, but it's just a rust preventive that they put on the rotors from the factory to keep them from rusting in the box. And the main thing is you want to get that off. Back in the day when rotors were a little better quality, we used to turn a lot of rotors, which we just don't do nowadays because, you know, you can buy a rotor for a nickel. So, but back then when we used to turn them, it was always my habit to wash them off with soap and water, because in that case you were trying to get rid of not so much this oily residue as you were trying to get rid of metal shavings from the lathe. And soapy water was cheap, and it always seemed to float away the metal shavings the best. And the problem with metal shavings, or you know, metal dust, or any of that type form material on the rotor, what it would do is it would embed itself in the pad, and ultimately it'd return as a, you know, brake squeal complaint or something like that. So, but in this case, we just want to remove all the packing oil or cosmoline or grease or whatever's on it to keep it from rusting. Once that's finished, we can take and prepare our caliper. We've got it right here. And as I mentioned earlier, I like to lubricate all metal to metal surfaces or contact surfaces. So what I'm going to use is just brake caliper grease that we always use. Through years and years of experience, I've had brake jobs come back that are 3-4 years old. I've used this lube on, and when I pull the abutment hardware off the caliper brackets, I still see evidence of this lube. When I pull the calipers off, I see evidence of the lube. Brake jobs aren't coming back seized up. You know, the pads aren't seizing in the holders. I'm not getting any returns on noisy brakes, squeal complaints, none of that. So I have no reason to not use this. I guess if you, long story, if you find something that works, you stick with it. Particularly if it makes your customers happy and seems to do a good job. Most premium pads that you buy, no matter where you get them from, come with hardware. You want to make sure if they don't, that you buy the hardware separate. And make sure it's a good quality hardware. And by that I mean a hardware that won't rust. If you get cheap hardware, it's going to rust on you. Pretty easy to tell. Just take a magnet. You know, obviously it holds up that bolt. Come on the hardware, it won't hold it. You know, so this hardware is stainless or, you know, another type of alloy that won't rust. So we'll continue on with greasing the metal to metal contacts. We're just going to use our caliper grease. You want to come here on the caliper bracket. Just be careful not to put, you know, huge gobs of it on here. You don't want it squeezing out on your pads, or onto your rotor. You want to get grease on the friction surface. So we're going to grease these up. If you have time, I can only imagine that taking your caliper bracket, once you get it clean, get all the rust off it, I can imagine that painting it, you know, using a, you know, etching primer or something, you know, coat of primer, coat of paint, and then letting that dry and then greasing it could only add another level of protection. So if you have time and you're doing that at home, I don't see how that could harm anything. So once you get your grease on there, take your new hardware, and that'll clip right on there. I mean, just perfect. We'll do both sides. Of course, at this point, we've already taken apart our pins and lubed those, so we've got this all ready to go. And like I say, this is the only surface I don't grease. Experience has taught me not to grease that because it just accumulates more dirt and junk. It doesn't allow the pads to slide. And the fact of the matter is, these are stainless. We're not going to build up rust on the outside edge. So it's unlikely that we're going to have a seizure there, you know, from the pad. So we'll go install our hardware, or install our pad on top of our new hardware, and this is where you'll see the beauty of doing a good job and cleaning everything. Your pad should always just slide just nice and easy, just like that. Fit right in that bracket. Oops, just popped it right off. Fit right in that bracket and just slide. If you have a good quality pad, you'll never have to grind your ears on the pads. I always buy the pad friction material. You know, for example, on this car it came OEM with ceramics, so we put ceramics back on it. You know, it's just my opinion there. We could go into a whole video of, you know, pads and friction material, but in this one we're just going to focus on just, you know, using good hardware, making sure your pads aren't seized up, and just doing the best job that you can. You can see here, those pads move just nice and easy with the new abutment hardware in place. While we're on the topic of brakes, brake hardware, the importance of doing a good brake job, have a look at this. We just brought this in. It's a 2008 Grand Caravan. The lady asked us to check out her brakes, and the front brakes are pretty shot on. It's got a bad wheel bearing. It needs a little bit of other work, but she also told me that they did their own rear brakes, so they know there's no trouble there. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but have a look at this. You can see you know, the pads are obviously new. The rotor's obviously been replaced at some point, less than a month, I assume. But look at this outer pad, pretty classic telltale sign there with that white smudge on it. That pad has gotten hot. It's gotten very hot, and it's actually turned the rotor that orangish color, and that's caused from, you know, being seized up. And being that it's just one pad, that can just be just a couple things. The outer pad can be seized up inside this brake hardware here, which has not been replaced, and which with this brand pad comes free in the box, which makes it even more silly. The other thing that can cause one pad to seize and not the other is a seized up caliper pin. You know, let's assume the piston works. Caliper goes over, locks up on the pins, you know, fries this outside pad off until the tension's released, and then it just continually repeats that process. Usually, if the pins are good and the caliper bracket isn't squeezing the pads and the caliper seizes up, it'll burn both pads off it. But in this case, you can obviously see the outer pad has been much hotter than an inner pad. And I think the cause of this one is it's missing the boot, you know, the hardware that goes around the pins here. It's got the rubber boot on the top one. It's got nothing down here. And like I say, they reused the old brake hardware here on the pads, and it's just ridiculous. It's also all preventable. I mean, look what it did to the rotor. I mean, it got this baby hot. Not quite blue, but hot. I mean, it smudged the rotor pretty good. Realistically, this whole job needs to be redone. The pads have turned ashy. You know, the caliper is seized, or the pin is seized here in the bracket. I'm 95% sure of it. We take it off, but if it's missing the boot, you can bet your dollar that's seized up in there. Just doesn't pay to skip, cut corners, not use your hardware, not clean your brackets. Ultimately, in the end, you're not saving yourself anything. It's actually costing money. So now that we've seen that example on that Caravan, we can take a look at a brake job here that I did, or that our shop did. You know, whether it's myself or the guy who works for me. This brake job is just over a year old. This was done December 4th. Right? Yeah, December 4th of last year, and today's December 10th, 2015. So it's been about a year. So we'll have a look at this. So this job would have been done complete, you know, pads, rotors, in New York weather. It would have been done in the wintertime, and, you know, currently it's wintertime again. So we'll have kind of a close look, see what the hardware, what kind of shape this is in. So we're just taking this apart just for the sake of demonstration, and just have a look. And we can see, well, let me move my light, I think we'll be able to see a little better. We can see on the pad, because it's always our habit, just like we're doing on the other brake job over there, to grease between, you know, like I say, all metal to metal points, you know, between the caliper and the pad. And we can see, even though dirt and stuff is collected on this, there's still ample amounts of grease there, even a full year later. And we can take a close look here at the hardware, particularly. See if I can orient this light so we can see the best. And we can see, if I can see, we'll see right here on this hardware that there's still grease under there also, you know, preventing the pad from getting squeezed in the caliper bracket, like we mentioned, you know, from excessive rust buildup underneath the brake hardware in the caliper bracket, you know, causing the pad to seize, just like we saw in that Caravan, you know, where this pad will seize and it'll just nuke the pad right off from it. You know, again, I mean, I don't mean to beat this to death, but we got this 2014 CRV. It's got about 30K on it. We look at these back brakes, and there's another classic example. So this is the driver's side. You can kind of scoot right over here. You know, right here on the passenger side, same exact thing. You know, if I strongly believe if they had lubricated underneath this hardware from the factory, it really could have prevented this. You can see, you know, caliper pins are perfectly fine. You know, the caliper retracted nicely. No issues there. The only problem here is underneath this hardware, it's, you know, build up some rust. It's pushed against the pad. It seized the pad in the holder, and end of story. Or, you know, I mean, I guess you can look at this two ways. Either this outer pad is seized, so every time it's, you know, the pad is engaged, it won't retract, or the inner pad is seized up so tight that the only pad that works is the outer pad. So this can kind of work in two different ways, but just wanted to kind of use this as an example of how important it is to lubricate and clean underneath the hardware and to clean the caliper mounting bracket. So we've got our caliper bracket loaded. You can just take, and of course you've got your rotor and everything cleaned at this point. Take and slip it right on there. You have to check, depending on what kind of vehicle you're working on, you know, whether or not they call for Loctite on these caliper bracket bolts, and, you know, what the torque spec is on the vehicle that you're working on, and take it from there. But it sounds silly almost, you know, talking about, you know, how important it is to have good brake hardware and make sure these pads are, you know, nice and free and they've cleaned and lubed behind them. But just experience tells me, and it showed me, you know, I've been doing brake jobs now for, you know, in this shop for over 16 years. I've done, you know, literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of brake jobs, and had to have, you know, the amount of comebacks I count on one hand, and that's, you know, not embellishing that at all. I think it says a lot for the quality of brake job that you do. You know, it just seems to be very routine to us, but recently, and you know, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I just see, you know, over and over and over again, you know, we get brake jobs that come in that, you know, obviously the pads are, you know, less than a year old, and they're completely toast, and, you know, inside pad's worn, or the hardware is missing, or the pins are seized up. And a lot of people think of brake jobs as just being kind of silly, run-of-the-mill stuff, you know, mindless work. But it's not. It's, you know, I can't stress enough how important it is to have everything clean and lubed and then put together, and you just do the best job you can. I mean, it's an investment. You know, why not protect that? And it's your brakes. You know, stopping's usually not an option. So it's just kind of one thing I've always paid really good attention to, and it's one thing when a customer picks up their car, you know, they can feel it. It's smooth, it's quiet, they don't smoke. You know, it doesn't pull, you know, so it's pretty important. Once you get your caliper bracket all on and tightened down, this can be the tricky part. If you've never done this, to do this without getting grease smudged all over everything, including your hands and the pads. But what I do is just use your caliper pin like a pivot. I'll take and just start the top one and just kind of let it swing right down. Of course, make sure your pads are in the bracket all the way, and then there you go. Then put your bottom pin in. You can do this vice versa too. You can do the bottoms, pivot the top in, or, you know, however, sometimes it's hard to just stick it on straight and then hold it and get the pins lined up, then you just end up with grease all over everything. So here's everything installed with the piston still pushed in. You should easily be able to move this caliper back and forth. Often the outer pad will stick to the caliper just with the grease, and you'll see that move just real nice through the hardware. And that's that. I mean, that's how we do a you know, good quality brake job, and to make sure that we're not going to have comebacks and we're not going to have, you know, seizure of the pad between the pad and the hardware and the caliper bracket. And that's where here, at least you know, in our environment, that we see the biggest failure rate is right there. That's why I really can't stress enough too, you know, about brake hardware. Not reusing it because it wears basically at the same rate as your pads, and it's almost impossible to clean all the rust and crap off it and have it keep its spring retention. Often these little ears are broke off them. So for the price of the hardware, it just makes sense to me to just, you know, either buy pads that come with it or buy it separate. But nowadays, the majority of the quality brakes that you buy come with brake hardware. And like I said, just make sure it's a good hardware, because I've seen, you know, crappy hardware bite you just as bad as the rust building up underneath it. I've seen this hardware turn, you know, to a solid flake of rust, and now you're in the same boat. So that's it. All right, viewers, like I say, that's it. Of course, we could go in depth on, you know, multiple different parts of the brake system, and, you know, should we flush it, shouldn't we? You know, should we put the piston in like we did, shouldn't we? You know, there's so many debatable topics, but like I say, I think we're going to end it at this and, you know, kind of start the discussion below. Important, change the hardware, clean the calipers, you know, clean the caliper brackets and the rotor face and you know, the hub face where the rotor goes on, and lubricate those. And it just, you know, for me, it comes from experience of doing, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of brake jobs, and, you know, not having comebacks and seeing failures and making notes of those. You know, it's probably the #1 thing that we do in our shop and in any shop is brake jobs. So we see a lot of failures, and we also see a lot of good work, and that's how you learn. You know, you'll see something, you know, say this thing comes in, you know, 2 years from now and has, you know, 25,000-30,000 miles on these brakes, and you see they're worn just, you know, just beautiful. That can be a good testimony that, you know, this system works. And honestly, that's what I've seen, you know, time and time again, year after year after year. Particularly with our customers who are repeat customers, we'll get the second, we'll get the third, we'll get the fourth brake job in some cases, and we can see that this system pays off. So I'm just sharing with you my experience. I hope you guys learned from it, and I look forward to the discussion below, and just leave any of your comments or questions or concerns you have down there. So thanks for watching. You can check us out on Facebook and Google Plus if you haven't done that already, and just ask that you subscribe to our channel if you want to stay up to date with our latest publications that roll out almost weekly. And just remember, viewers, if I can do it, you can do it. Thanks for watching.